Human kills apex predator, barehanded, while aliens watch in horror. The shuttle descended through thick green clouds, and Scholar Kelvix pressed all four of his hands against the viewport, watching the jungle moon of Vareth 4 grow larger beneath them. And he felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of excitement and fear that he would never admit to his colleagues. "Beautiful and deadly," whispered biologist Yeneth from her seat, her scaled face reflecting the green light from outside. And her voice carried that tone of professional appreciation that scientists used when discussing things that could kill them. Technician Oris said nothing at all, his large eyes blinking rapidly as his small hands gripped the safety harness. And everyone on the team knew that the young Pelin researcher had not slept in 3 days, because the nightmares about Vareth 4 had started the moment he received this assignment. The shuttle shook as it entered the lower atmosphere, and Kelvix turned away from the window to look at the final member of their team, the one who sat in the corner with his eyes closed and his breathing slow and steady, like he was taking a peaceful nap instead of descending onto one of the most dangerous moons in the known galaxy park. Junho was human. Kelvix had studied humans extensively before this mission because the insurance company required a Death Worlder escort for any survey team entering Class 7 environments. And he had learned many fascinating facts about the species from Earth. But seeing one in person was different from reading about them in academic papers. The human was not particularly large by galactic standards, standing perhaps average height with a lean build that suggested efficiency rather than raw power. And his face carried an expression of complete calm that Kelvix found both reassuring and slightly disturbing. "We are approaching the landing zone," announced the pilot through the speakers. And Junho opened his eyes without any sign of surprise or disorientation, immediately alert and scanning the cabin like he had never truly been asleep at all. "Mr. Park," Kelvix said, using the formal address he had been taught was appropriate for humans. "I want to thank you again for accepting this contract. Though I must be honest that I believe our technology will prove sufficient for any threats we encounter." The human looked at him with dark eyes that seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it, and simply nodded once without speaking. "The Galactic Biological Institute has provided us with the most advanced portable shield generators available," Kelvix continued, feeling the need to fill the silence that the humans seemed perfectly comfortable with. "And our stun weapons are capable of incapacitating creatures up to 3,000 kilograms. The Vareth Stalker weighs 4,000, Yeneth said quietly. And Kelvix shot her an annoyed look because there was no need to frighten Oris any further, which is why we also have the backup systems and emergency beacons and extraction protocols," Kelvix replied quickly, watching as Oris seemed to shrink even smaller in his seat. And he wished the insurance company had not required them to bring a human, because the presence of a Death Worlder only reminded everyone how dangerous this mission truly was. The shuttle landed with a gentle thump, and the rear door began to lower, revealing a wall of green vegetation so thick that it seemed almost solid. And the air that rushed in was hot and wet, and carried the smell of rotten growth and ancient, predatory things. Junho was the first one off the shuttle, moving down the ramp with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for a creature his size. And he stopped at the bottom to scan the tree line with those absorbing eyes, while the aliens gathered their equipment behind him. "The survey site is approximately 2 kilometers northeast," Kelvix announced, activating his datapad and projecting a holographic map into the humid air. "And we will be cataloging flora and fauna along the way, with particular focus on any signs of Vareth Stalker activity." "There are signs everywhere?" Junho said. And everyone froze, because these were the first words the human had spoken since boarding the shuttle 6 hours ago. "I beg your pardon?" Kelvix asked, his four hands suddenly uncertain of what to do with themselves. The human pointed toward a tree at the edge of the clearing, and Kelvik squinted but saw nothing unusual until Junho walked over and placed his hand against the bark, showing deep grooves that had been carved into the wood, territorial markings. The human said, "Fresh within the last 2 days. And the height suggests a large adult." Yennefer moved closer to examine the marks, and her scaled face went slightly pale as she realized what she was looking at. And she turned to Kelvix with an expression that said many things she was too professional to speak aloud. "How did you see that from the ramp?" she asked. The human. Junho shrugged. A gesture that Kelvix had learned was the human equivalent of dismissive uncertainty, and said, "I looked." Aris made a small sound that might have been a whimper, and Kelvix activated the shield generator, watching the comforting shimmer of the energy field spring to life around the group. And he told himself that ancient claw marks on a tree meant nothing when you had the finest technology the Galactic Biological Institute could provide. "We proceed as planned," Kelvix announced with more confidence than he felt. "And Mr. Park, please alert us if you notice anything else of concern." The human was already walking toward the jungle, his eyes moving constantly across the vegetation in a pattern that seemed almost mechanical. And he paused at the edge of the trees to look back at the group with an expression that Kelvix could not read. "Stay close to me," Junho said, "and if I tell you to run, you run without asking questions." Then he turned and disappeared into the green darkness, and the aliens followed because they had no other choice. And somewhere in the distance, something large moved through the underbrush with a sound like thunder wrapped in silk. And the jungle moon of Vareth IV welcomed its newest visitors with the patient hunger of a world that had been killing things since before their species learned to walk upright. Human kills apex predator, barehanded while aliens watch in horror. The jungle swallowed them whole, and Kelvix found himself struggling to breathe in the thick, wet air that seemed to coat his lungs with every inhalation. And he watched the human move through the undergrowth with an ease that made the rest of them look like clumsy children stumbling through their first steps. 3 hours into the survey, and they had cataloged 17 new plant species and observed 4 different predators from a safe distance. And Kelvix had almost begun to relax when the shield generator made a sound that no shield generator should ever make. It was a high-pitched whine followed by a deep mechanical cough. And then the comforting shimmer of the energy field flickered twice before disappearing entirely, leaving them standing in the hostile jungle with nothing between them and every hungry thing that lived there. "What happened?" Yennefer demanded, her voice sharp with controlled panic as she rushed to examine the device. "Moisture infiltration," Oris whispered, his large eyes somehow growing even larger as his trembling hands moved across the diagnostic panel. "The humidity exceeded the operational parameters and the primary coils have fused." "Then activate the backup," Kelvix ordered, feeling his 4 hearts begin to beat faster as the sounds of the jungle suddenly seemed much louder and much closer. Oris looked at him with an expression of pure terror and said, "The backup draws power from the same coils." Silence fell over the group, and in that silence, they could hear things moving in the shadows around them. Things with claws and teeth and the patient hunger of apex predators who had just discovered that their prey was no longer protected. "We need to reach the extraction point," Kelvix said, pulling out his communicator and feeling his hand shake as he tried to establish a connection with the shuttle. "We can call for immediate pickup and be off this moon within the hour." But the communicator only produced static, and Kelvix realized with growing horror that the same moisture that had killed their shields had also disrupted their long-range communications. And they were now completely alone on a Class 7 death world with nothing but their wits and their stun weapons that could not stop the largest predator on the planet. "Higher ground," Junho said, his calm voice cutting through the panic like a blade through soft flesh. We need to find higher ground and build a fire before nightfall. A fire? Yenneith repeated, staring at the human like he had suggested they strip naked and dance for the predators. You want to create an open combustion reaction in the middle of hostile territory? Fire keeps predators away, the human replied, already moving toward a rocky hill visible through a gap in the canopy. Most animals fear it because they cannot control it. Most civilized species fear it for the same reason, Kelvix muttered. But he followed the human because there were no better options available, and at least Junho seemed to have some kind of plan. They reached the hill as the light began to fade, and the jungle transformed around them from a place of danger into something far worse. A realm of shadows and sounds and yellow eyes that reflected the dying sun with hungry anticipation. Junho gathered dry wood and strange fibrous plants, and Oris watched him with the fascination of someone observing an alien ritual that defied all understanding. And when the human pulled 2 sticks from his pack and began rubbing them together with rapid practiced motions, the young Pelin actually took a step backward in fear. He is going to create fire with friction, Yenneith said, her voice carrying a mixture of horror and academic interest that only a scientist could manage. I read that humans could do this, but I never believed it was true. Smoke began to rise from the sticks, and Junho leaned down to blow gently on the glowing ember that had formed, coaxing it to life with the patience of someone who had done this many times before. And within minutes, a small fire crackled in the center of their makeshift camp. The aliens huddled close to them flames despite their instinctive discomfort because the fire represented safety and the human who had created it represented something they were only beginning to understand. How are you so calm? Yenneith asked, watching Junho as he sat with his back against a rock and his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. We are stranded on a death world without protection, and you act like this is a normal evening. The human was quiet for a moment, and then he said, This is not my first jungle. You have been in situations like this before? Kelvix asked, his curiosity temporarily overcoming his fear. Many times, Junho replied. Earth is also a death world, and I grew up learning how to survive in places that wanted to kill me. Ars made a sound that was half laugh and half sob and said, Your own planet tried to kill you, and you were still alive? Everything tries to kill humans, Junho said, with that small shrug that seemed to carry so much meaning. We just refuse to die. The fire crackled and popped, and the night pressed in around them like a living thing. And somewhere in the darkness, something large began to circle their camp, with footsteps so heavy that the ground trembled with each impact. Ovix saw the reflection first. 2 yellow eyes that burned in the darkness like stars made of malice and hunger. And he opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out, because his body had forgotten how to function in the presence of true terror. The Vera stalker emerged from the shadows, and it was everything the files had promised and worse. 7 meters of muscle and armor and teeth that gleamed in the firelight like polished daggers, and 6 legs that moved with a horrible grace that spoke of countless successful hunts. Nobody move, Junho said quietly, and he slowly rose to his feet while the monster watched him with those burning eyes. And for a moment the human and the beast simply stared at each other across the flickering flames. Then the stalker opened its mouth and roared, a sound so deep and powerful that it shook the rocks and scattered the fire and turned the blood in Kelvix's veins to ice. And Park Junho, the quiet human who had barely spoken 10 sentences in the past 12 hours, roared right back. Human kills apex predator barehanded while aliens watch in horror. The sound that came from the human was not a word or a cry or anything that belonged in civilized space, but rather a primal challenge that seemed to reach back through millions of years of evolution to a time when his ancestors fought for survival against creatures just as deadly as the monster before them. The Varith stalker actually paused, its 6 legs freezing mid-step as its predator brain tried to process what it was witnessing, because nothing on this moon had ever challenged it, and nothing had ever made a sound that suggested it was not afraid. Kelvix felt his 4 knees go weak, and he grabbed onto Yenneith for support as the human took a step toward the creature that outweighed him by at least 3,000 kilograms. And he wanted to scream at Junho to stop, but his voice had abandoned him along with his courage. "Get behind the rocks," Junho said without taking his eyes off the stalker. "And do not run unless I tell you to run." "You cannot fight that thing," Yenneith hissed, her scales rippling with fear. "It will kill you in seconds." "Probably," the human agreed. "But it will not kill you." The stalker seemed to recover from its confusion and began to circle the camp, its massive head swaying from side to side as it studied this strange prey that refused to flee. And Oris finally broke and tried to scramble toward the rocks, but his foot caught on a root and he fell hard onto the ground. With a cry of pain, the monster's head snapped toward the fallen Pelin, and recognition flickered in those yellow eyes. The recognition of weakness and vulnerability, and easy meat. And it lunged toward Oris with a speed that should have been impossible for something so large. Junho moved faster. He threw himself between the alien and the predator with no weapon, and no armor, and nothing but the desperate courage of a species that had clawed its way to dominance on a world that had tried to kill them for 1,000,000 years. And he screamed again, that raw, aggressive sound that seemed to shake the very air. The stalker stopped so close that Junho could have reached out and touched its teeth. And for a heartbeat, the 2 apex predators from different worlds simply stared at each other. Then the human grabbed a burning branch from the scattered fire and swung it at the creatures. Faced the stalker, recoiled from the flames with a hiss of surprise, and Junho pressed forward, waving the torch in wide arcs that forced the monster to back away step by step. And Kelvix watched in disbelief as a single human drove back an apex predator through nothing but fire and sheer audacity. "Get Oris behind cover," Junho commanded, and Yenneith rushed forward to drag the whimpering Pelin toward the rocks, while the human kept the stalker at bay. But the creature was learning. It watched the torch with those intelligent eyes, and Kelvix could almost see it calculating, measuring the reach of the flames against the length of its own limbs. And when Junho swung again, the stalker did not retreat, but instead lashed out with one massive clawed foot. The blow caught the torch and sent it spinning into the darkness. And suddenly the human stood before the monster with nothing but his bare hands. "Run," Junho said quietly. And this time, there was no confidence in his voice, only the calm acceptance of someone who had made peace with what was about to happen. "We cannot leave you," Yenneith called from behind the rocks. But she was already pulling Oris away because her body knew what her conscience refused to accept. Kelvix found himself frozen in place, unable to flee and unable to help. And he watched as the stalker seemed to smile with a mouth full of teeth longer than his arms. The creature lunged, and Junho did something completely unexpected. Instead of running or dodging or trying to fight, he dropped to the ground and rolled toward the stalker rather than away from it, passing beneath the snapping jaws and coming up on the creature's left side where its eyes could not track him. The monster spun with surprising speed, but Junho was already moving, staying in its blind spot, forcing it to turn in circles as it tried to find the prey that kept disappearing. From its view, Kelvix realized what the human was doing. He was learning every second that Junho survived was another second of information about how the stalker moved and attacked, and where its weaknesses might be hidden. And the human was using his smaller size and greater agility to study the monster even as he fought to stay alive. But the stalker was also learning. And when Junho tried to roll beneath it again, the creature was ready, slamming one massive leg down on his path and forcing him to change direction straight into a swinging claw the blow caught Junho across the ribs and sent him tumbling through the underbrush with a spray of blood that looked black in the dim light of the dying fire. And he crashed against a tree trunk with a sound that made Kelvix's stomachs turn. Human did not get up. The stalker approached slowly, savoring its victory the way all apex predators savored the moment of the kill. And Kelvix felt tears running down his face because he was about to watch a brave creature die for strangers who had treated him like a primitive curiosity. Then Junho moved, did not stand or speak or make any dramatic gesture, but simply shifted his weight and pushed himself onto his hands and knees with blood streaming down his side and dripping from wounds that should have been fatal. The stalker froze again, its predator brain unable to understand why this prey refused to die. Park Junho rose to his feet with agonizing slowness and turned to face the monster that had just torn him open. And his expression had not changed from that mask of complete calm that he had worn since the moment he stepped off the shuttle. "Not done yet," he said, and he raised his bloody hands into a fighting stance that looked almost peaceful. The Vara stalker looked at this impossible creature, this small soft thing that should have been dead 3 times over, and for the first time in its existence it felt something that might have been uncertainty, but hunger won over caution, and the apex predator charged. Human kills apex predator barehanded while aliens watch in horror. The stalker came at him like a landslide made of teeth and muscle, and Junho waited until the last possible moment before throwing himself to the side, feeling the wind of the creature's passage ruffle his hair as jaws that could crush starship hull. Plating snapped shut on empty air. He had fought dangerous things before. There was the tiger in the mountains of Korea, when he was young and foolish and thought he could track anything. And there was the crocodile in the river that had taken his best friend and nearly taken him. And there were the men in the war zones who were sometimes more dangerous than any animal could ever be. But he had never fought anything like this. The stalker spun with terrifying speed, and one of its middle legs caught Junho in the shoulder, sending him staggering backward with a burst of pain that made his vision go white for a moment. And he barely managed to duck under the follow-up strike that would have taken his head clean off. Blood was flowing freely from the wound in his side, and he could feel his strength beginning to fade with every heartbeat that pumped more of his life onto the ground. But he could not stop because the aliens were still behind him, and they were counting on him to save them. He circled left, and the stalker tracked him with those burning yellow eyes. And Junho studied the creature even as he struggled to stay alive. The armor plates covered most of its body, but there were gaps at the joints where the legs met the torso. And the throat was protected by a thick ruff of leathery skin that might be softer than the rest. And the eyes were exposed because even apex predators needed to see their prey. He needed to get close. The thought was insane, and he knew it was insane, but there was no other option. Because he could not outrun this thing, and he could not outlast it, and his only chance was to do something so unexpected that the creature's instincts would not know how to respond. Stalker lunged again, and this time Junho did not dodge, but instead stepped forward into the attack. He felt teeth graze his back as he passed beneath the creature's jaw, tearing through his shirt and the skin beneath, and he grabbed onto the thick, leathery ruff of the stalker's throat with both hands and held on with every ounce of strength he had. Left the creature went berserk. It thrashed and spun and slammed itself against trees in a desperate attempt to dislodge the thing that had attached itself to its most vulnerable area. And Junho felt his body being battered against bark and stone and earth, but he did not let. Though he could not let go, his fingers found the soft flesh beneath the ruff, and he dug them in. Feeling the creature's pulse thundering against his palms. And he wrapped his arm around the stalker's throat and began to squeeze with the technique that his grandfather had taught him when he was just a boy learning to survive on a world that wanted to kill him. The stalker roared, and the sound was different now, less confident and more desperate. And it threw itself backward and crushed Junho against a boulder with enough force to crack his ribs. He did not let go. Creature rolled, and his arm was twisted at an angle that sent fire shooting through his shoulder. And he could feel the bones grinding against each other, but he did not let go behind the rocks. Kelvix watched in horrified fascination as the human clung to the monster like some kind of parasitic nightmare, taking punishment that would have killed any of them 10 times over, but refusing to release his grip. Why does he not give up? Aris whispered, his voice trembling with something that might have been fear or might have been awe. Because humans do not give up, Yeneth replied. And there was a new tone in her voice that sounded almost like reverence. Their species survived by being too stubborn to die. The stalker's movements were becoming slower and more erratic as Junho's grip cut off the blood flow to its brain. And the creature staggered and stumbled and made sounds that were almost pitiful as it realized for the first time in its existence that it was losing. Junho felt the change, and he squeezed harder, ignoring the screaming pain in his broken ribs and his torn flesh and his dislocated shoulder, focusing everything he had left on maintaining that grip until the job was done. Minutes passed. The stalker fell to its knees, and its yellow eyes began to dim. And still Junho held on, because he had seen too many things play dead, and then spring back to life when their prey relaxed. More minutes. The creature collapsed onto its side, and its legs twitched weakly, and then went still. And the great chest that had been heaving with desperate breaths slowly deflated for the final time. Even then, Junho did not release his grip. He counted to 100 in his head, a trick his grandfather had taught him. And only when he was certain that the apex predator of Varith 4 would never move again, did he finally let go and roll away from the corpse. He lay on his back in the dirt and the blood and the broken vegetation, staring up at the alien stars through a gap in the canopy. And he listened to the sound of his own breathing and marveled at the fact that he was still alive. The aliens emerged from behind the rocks and approached slowly, their faces wearing expressions that Junho was too tired to interpret. Kelvix stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the dead stalker and then at the bloody human lying beside it. And his 4 hands moved in a gesture that might have been prayer or might have been the signing of some ancient protective ward. How? He asked, and his voice cracked on the single word. Junho tried to answer, but his body had finally decided that it had enough. And the darkness rushed in from the edges of his vision and swallowed him whole before he could speak. The last thing he heard was Yeneth shouting something about medical supplies. And then there was nothing at all. Human kills apex predator barehanded while aliens watch in horror. Yeneth worked through the night with medical supplies that were never designed for human biology, following instructions that Aris read aloud from an emergency database, while Kelvix held a torch and tried not to look at the amount of blood that covered the Kujun. Clearing. His cardiovascular system is completely different from ours, Aris said, his voice steadier now that he had a task to focus on. But the basic principles should be the same. Should be is not good enough. Yeneth snapped as she applied another pressure bandage to a wound that refused to stop bleeding. This creature saved our lives, and I will not let him die because our medical knowledge is incomplete. Kelvix looked at the dead stalker lying in the shadows of the edge of the firelight and felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had been settled and certain for his entire life now crumbling into dust. He had written papers about humans. He had lectured students about their primitive origins and their violent history, and their disturbing tendency to pursue predators rather than flee from them. And he had used words like interesting and concerning to describe a species that he had never truly understood, but he understood them now. Park Junho groaned and his eyes fluttered open. And Yenneith made a sound of relief that was completely unprofessional as she pressed another bandage against his torn side. "Do not move," she ordered. "You have lost more blood than I thought possible, and your body needs time to repair itself. The others?" Junho asked, and his voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes were moving across the clearing, checking on the aliens he had nearly died to protect. "We are fine," Kelvik said, stepping forward so the human could see him. "Thanks to you." Junho seemed to accept this information, and his eyes closed again. But this time, Yenneith assured them it was just sleep rather than unconsciousness. And the three aliens took turns keeping watch until the sun began to rise over the jungle. The rescue team arrived 6 hours later, alerted by the emergency beacon that Kelvix had finally managed to repair. And the soldiers who descended from the shuttle stopped in their tracks when they saw the scene that awaited them for exhausted aliens, huddled around a fire that had burned down to embers, guarding an unconscious human who was more bandaged than skin. While behind them lay the massive corpse of the most dangerous predator on Vareth 4. "What happened here?" the squad leader demanded, her compound eyes clicking rapidly as she tried to process what she was seeing. "The human happened," Yenneith replied, and there was a note of pride in her voice that surprised even herself. They loaded Junho onto a medical stretcher and carried him back to the shuttle. And Kelvix insisted on riding in the medical bay so he could monitor the human's condition, even though the doctors assured him that their patient was stable. "Why?" Kelvix asked when Junho woke up again 3 hours into the flight back to the research station. The human turned his head slowly, his movements limited by the tubes and monitors attached to his battered body, and looked at Kelvix with those dark, absorbing eyes. "Why, what?" he asked. "Why did you do it?" Kelvix pressed, all 4 of his hands gesturing in frustration. "You could have run and left us to die, and no one would have blamed you because the odds were impossible. And we had treated you like a primitive curiosity from the moment we met." Junho was quiet for a long moment, and Kelvix worried that he had fallen asleep again. But then the human spoke in a voice that was rough with exhaustion and something deeper. "Oris fell," he said simply. "He was scared, and he fell, and someone had to help him. But we are not your people," Kelvix insisted. "We are strangers from species you had never met before this mission. So why would you die for us?" The human seemed to consider this question carefully, as if searching for words that could explain something that needed no explanation where he came from. "On Earth," Junho finally said, "we have a saying that the measure of a person is what they do when no one is watching and when there is nothing to gain. And what does that mean?" "It means that helping someone should not depend on whether they can help you back," the human replied. "It means that the right thing to do is still the right thing, even when it costs you everything." Kelvix sat back in his seat and felt the last pieces of his old worldview crumble away, replaced by something new and strange and almost frightening in its implications. The story spread quickly through the research station, and then through the Galactic Biological Institute, and then through the council halls where important beings made important decisions about the fate of civilizations. A human had killed a Vareth stalker with his bare hands while protecting aliens who had treated him with dismissive courtesy, and he had nearly died in the process, but his only concern upon waking was whether the aliens were safe. "We need to reassess our understanding of humans," the council speaker announced at an emergency session. "This incident suggests that our classification of their species as Category 3 Deathworlders may be inadequate. What category would you suggest?" asked a delegate from the Mirathi homeworld. His 4 hands fidgeting nervously, the speaker was silent for a long moment before answering. "Unknown," she finally said, "because I do not think we have a category for a species that will die for strangers, simply because it is the right thing to do." Back on the research station, Yennefer visited Junho in the medical bay one last time before he was discharged. "I wanted to thank you," she said, standing awkwardly by his bed, "and to ask you a question." "Ask," Junho replied. "Are all humans like you?" The human almost smiled, which was the first expression other than calm focus that Yennefer had ever seen on his face. "No," he said. "Some are much worse." And Yennefer did not know whether to be relieved or terrified by that answer. 3 weeks later, Park Junho finished his recovery and accepted a new contract from another research team that needed a human escort for a survey mission on a mesh. Class 6 ice world. He packed his bag with the same quiet efficiency that he did everything. And he did not think about the Varys stalker, or the aliens he had saved, or the way that Kelvix had hugged him with all 4 arms when they said goodbye. He simply moved on to the next job, because that was what humans did. Somewhere in the archives of the Galactic Council, Scholar Kelvix's official report sat in a file that was flagged for priority reading by every species that might one day encounter humanity. The final line of the report had been edited 17 times before Kelvix was satisfied with the wording. But in the end he had kept it simple, because simple words carried the most weight. "Do not provoke them," the report concluded. "Do not threaten them, and above all, do not endanger anything they have chosen to protect."